Hello, I'm Dr. David Santos, and we're going to be continuing our study in ancient Mediterranean history. And for this lecture, we're going to be looking at the history of Athens. So, to start out, here's our basic outline. We're going to start by looking at the very ancient Athens from 1500 moving onward. We're going to look at the Archaic period in some detail. We're going to look at the rise of democracy. This is an important aspect of Athenian culture for us to understand. The golden age of Athens in the 5th century BC is going to be one of the highlights in a time period that we look back to today and see as influencing all of Western culture. We're going to look at some of the Athenian literature. We're going to take a quick peek at the Peloponnesian Wars, and then the later decline and basically fall of Athens to the Macedonian rule. So our overview of ancient Athens, we're going to try to put that in the context of ancient Greece. We're going to look at its significance, and we're going to give you some timelines as we go along. So this big, broad overview of ancient Athens is that it's one of the most prominent city-states of ancient Greece. Of course, it plays this pivotal role in shaping Western civilization, and even today, people look back at that period of ancient Greece and the ancient world more broadly and say, this is a time period where the intellectual advancements still impact culture today. As Western civilization was developing, this is one of the things they looked at, along with biblical Judeo-Christian ethics, and pull all these things together into what we know as Western civilization. So it's really a system of ethics, critical thinking, philosophy, biblical worldview, and funneling all that into governmental systems. And we can see how these things developed and why they look back and found them as being important. We're going to look at some very specific leaders in the development of democracy. One is Cleisthenes and Pericles, is the other. So Athens is this cultural, intellectual hub during its golden age. So everything went in and out of it. We see figures such as Socrates, Plato, and Sophocles as thinkers of that age that we still hearken to as we consider, especially when we consider things like ethics and government. Of course, Athens also led to this Greek coalition in the Persian Wars. That's what making its rise as a dominant naval power. So it's rivaled by Sparta, especially during the Peloponnesian Wars, but Athenian achievements in art, literature, political thought really outlasted any other Greek civilization or Greek city-state. So its significance, of course, is that it became this beacon of culture, democracy, philosophy in the ancient world. It profoundly influenced our culture today, and the system that came out of it, democracy, is introduced in this time period and becomes a standard for governments as we know them. Aristotle later would then begin to build ideas around democracy and how that ought to work. And they started to think about things rather than a mob-ruled democracy. They moved it into Republican kind of thing, small R. We're not talking Republican Party. We're talking about republicanism. So putting limits on democracy, they put too many limits in some ways too. They had problems in terms of individual liberty, but the ideas or concepts of individual liberty come out of this and spring into republicanism. And that's why even the United States, it's not a democracy, it is a constitutional democratic republic, or just a constitutional republic, however you want to phrase it. Has democratic principles, but republicanism is really what the founding fathers meant, and they draw it from here. This brief timeline. Athens' history spans from that mythical foundation to its eventual decline under Macedonians. So it's according to legend, the city was founded by King Theseus around 1500 BC, with early Athens ruled by monarchs, and they eventually transitioned over to this aristocracy, so elite rule. Since 6th century BC, Solon comes in and reforms the political system, and that's basically forced by social unrest. Clisthenes he has democratic reforms as well. In 508, he establishes the foundation of Athenian democracy, and Athens reaches its pinnacle in the 5th century BC under Pericles. And he led the city through the Persian Wars and into this golden age that came next. And the Peloponnesian Wars with the Spartans led to Athens' defeat and weakened its overall dominance in the region. The city regains some of its stability. It ends up falling to the Macedonian control in the 4th century BC, following Philip II's victory, and that begins this new shift leading towards the Alexander period. So looking at this ancient background, we're going to look at mythological origins, early political structure, and economic and social development. So we'll start out this legend of Theseus and the unification of Attica. So it's according to these Greek mythology that Theseus, the legendary hero and king of Athens, he's credited with the unification of Attica. That's the region that surrounds the city. So before Theseus' reign, the region was divided into several independent communities, and each of them had their own leaders. And Theseus comes in, he gains power, and the mythology is that he unified all these fragmented settlements under one rule, Athenian rule, and he centralizes authority in Athens. He creates a single political unity. This unification, known as synthesism, it sort of lays the foundation for the future idea of Athens as it gains dominance. So as the legend goes, it obviously portrays Theseus as a symbol of Athenian strength, heroism, and he's celebrated for these other exploits such as slaying the Minotaur and his role in establishing Athens as a cultural and political leader in Greece. So later rulers will look back at this time period and the unification and use these stories to promote basically Athenian nationalism and build an entire identity around that. So the early kings of Athens, many of whom are rooted in mythology, they hold a significant role in shaping the identity and the cultural heritage of the city. And that's what we're talking about, is shaping this identity and really building a patriotic system and using these systems to promote that. One of the most famous one is Cecrops, and he is half human and he's half serpent, and he's believed to have founded the city and introduced key institutions like marriage and writing. So it's kind of interesting just to look at the mythology behind some of these things and ask yourself, what if this was potentially a real king? What were the attributes that he had that made this later cultural memory of him think of him in this way? Or they're just taking ancient mythology and just kind of shoving their popular imagery into that. So the next person would be Ercathes, and he's associated with the goddess Athena and said to have defended the city against these external threats. Pandion, he's an ancestor of Theseus. He's credited with fostering early religious practices, while King Aegeus, he's the father of Theseus, is tied to the myth of the Minotaur, and he symbolizes protection of the city's people. So you put all these together, and you have all these rulers, and you have this mythological antiquity of the city that helps them build stories of their past to show how they came into being, and not just coming into being by accident, but having their culture and society shaped by these ancient figures who they gave these mythological characteristics to. So that moving from a monarchy to aristocracy, so there's this transition. It's a gradual process. It's reflected a broader social and political change in the city. So in the early days, Athens was ruled by kings with authority to concentrate into a single figure all of their power. By the 8th century BC, power began shifting away from that monarchy towards a group of noble families. The last king, Codrus, who was said to have sacrificed himself to save Athens, after which the monarchy was replaced by a system of acrons, or chief magistrates. They are chosen from the aristocracy. Over time, the aristocratic families consolidated control, and they're governing the city through the Areopagus, and this is a council that's made up of the acrons. So it's a new political structure that completely changed what the city's government looked like after that mythological monarchy. So these families, they became the noble families, and they are described as being well-born. They hold power, and a significant level of power. They control nearly every aspect of political and social life. After the decline of the monarchy, they established a system where political authority was concentrated in the hands of these families. And they dominate key positions, such as the acrons and the magistrate, which are the highest magistrates, and members of any of these councils responsible for judicial matters or religious matters. They control everything. They have a vast amount of land, and that gave them economic dominance as well, and their wealth allowed them to sponsor religious ceremonies and festivals. And they reinforced their social status through these gatherings. Their monopoly and power excluded the majority of Athenian citizens from meaningful political participation. So, in other words, anyone not part of the well-born or someone closely related to them is not going to have any voice in this system. So let's move to the next phase. We're going to look at their influence of Mycenaean civilization, which thrived around 1600 to 1100 BC. It had lasting influence on Athens, and especially during the early development. It's one of the dominant cultures of the Bronze Age, Greece. The Mycenaeans left this legacy, and Athenians would look back and think about the architecture and the political system and the cultural transitions that shaped Athens as being from these Mycenaeans. And Mycenaean Athens was a fortified citadel. its remnants can be seen, and it's the remnants of a palace, and it had defensive walls, and it really demonstrates the abilities that they had during the Mycenaean period. Of course, we know from previous studies that those things were lost for a time period, and when we get to the period we're looking at now, those technologies begin to become revived, maybe is how I'll put it. So politically, the Mycenaean system of centralized rules with kings governing from these palatial centers, they influenced the early monarchical structure of Athens. And additionally, religious practices and myths, that includes the worship of early Greek gods like Zeus and Athena, they can be traced back to this Mycenaean period. So although Mycenaean civilization collapsed around 1100 BC, its cultural and political foundations continued to shape the evolution of Athens during the Greek Dark Ages and into the Archaic period. Early trade networks. The early stages of its development, Athens actively participated in trade networks. They were colonizers, and they were essentially doing these things to grow their economic system, find prosperity. It's by the 8th century BC, Athens began to establish trade routes throughout the Aegean. And this facilitates the exchange of goods like olive oil, wine, pottery, and other Greek city-state goods. And foreign powers such as the Phoenicians and the Egyptians were part of this trade route. These trade networks helped Athens acquire valuable resources, including metals, luxury goods that were not readily available locally. The city also expanded into its influence through colonizing. They found some settlements along the coast of the Mediterranean and Black Sea, and these colonies really helped them establish these trade routes. And because of these colonies, you have a more robust cultural exchange with Phoenicians and Egyptians and others. All right, moving into the Archaic period, 800 to 500. Social and economic challenges. So it's during this period Athens faces these significant social and economic challenges. They contributed to rising tensions within the city-state. The increasing wealth of the elites lead to this pronounced social inequality because there's no political say. There's no movement from wherever you start out into a higher level. You're not able to move up economically or move up in status, or at least it'd be extremely rare. And if you look at the mythology, it's interesting that some of those mythological accounts are about someone changing their status, and you can see where the unrest would come from those mythological stories where they talked about things like virtues and how a virtuous person, using their definition, should have opportunities to become something else, move out of poverty into the elites. And the mythology of moving from being a person to a demigod or god, things like that, stories like that would lead to these kinds of moments of unrest. So we see the elites accumulating all the wealth and resources. There is this rise of more than just inequality. It's inability to even survive at some points. So it gave rise to debt slavery, where many poor citizens just find themselves forced into a situation where they have to borrow money, and they borrow money from the wealthy landowners, and when they can't repay their debts, they become enslaved to their creditors. So this kind of thing happens in the Bible as well, but the Bible put limits on it, time periods where there was a maximum number of years that you could be what we would call an indentured servant. That actually makes its way into Western civilization as well, and that's why you see a limit of 7 years in the indentured servitude of Western civilization, early Western civilization. Here, they become slaves, and this economic crisis deepens. The peasants get further and further into situations where they become more and more hopeless. Unrest grows, and it leads to protests, demands for reform, and creates all this turmoil. And that sets the stage for the emergence of a new political system. And we see that change take place. Solon's one of the people that makes this change. He's a prominent Athenian statesman, poet, lawmaker. He emerges in the 6th century BC as a pivotal figure in the political and social landscape of Athens. He was appointed in 594 BC as an acron. He's tasked with addressing the growing unrest caused by this widespread social inequality, and it's caused by an economic distress, and it's the plight of debtors facing enslavement. And that's one of the major causes. So he has this legacy of being this wise lawmaker and reformer, and that idea carries on through Athenian society. So he is the lawmaker. He is brings the foundational principles of Athens, and specifically Athenian democracy, influencing contemporary politics, and really changes the trajectory of Athenian society. So things that he did as a statesman, one of the most significant measures was the cancellation of debts, and this liberated many of those slaves that were going to be in slavery forever. He established new political structures, including a popular court system and the Council of 400, which enabled broader participation in governance. So these reforms, they addressed the immediate crisis, but they did more than that as well. They also laid the groundwork for the development of true Athenian democracy, which will come later. That gets set up as a political system, but he's established a foundation here that will open those doors. So, of course, we don't always go straight to that. From there, we get to look at the tyranny of Persistratus and sons. And he comes on the scene, and along with his sons, is an interesting chapter in Athenian history during the Archaic period. He's a popular leader. He seizes power in 561, and he establishes a tyranny characterized by effective governance and extensive infrastructure projects, including the construction of aqueducts that improve access to water for the growing population. His rule was notable for cultural patronage. So he promotes festivals and artistic endeavors and the construction of temples. And the problem is the tyranny faced challenges, particularly from rival factions within Athens, and growing dissatisfaction among aristocratic elites. Sorry about that. Following the death of Persistratus and the brief rule of his sons, the tyranny ultimately fell in 510 BC, paving the way for the reemergence of democratic governance and significant political changes that would shape the future of Athens. Rise of democracy. Cleisthenes, brings in democratic reforms, harkening back to the previous period of moving towards democracy. He's often referred to the father of Athenian democracy. He introduced a series of reforms in 508 that lay the foundation for a more inclusive participatory political system. And these reforms are considered revolutionary in shaping the democratic structure. So he reorganizes the political landscape of Athens. He divides the population into demes, which are like local communities or districts, maybe like counties today. And that is becomes the basic political unit. Each citizen was registered and determined their political rights and obligations. So they also have this unique thing that we still have today that's kind of getting lost in American culture. But along with your political rights also come political obligations. And a couple of those would be, in our terms, there's an obligation to, as a citizen, to vote, for example. There are certain aspects of our system that we are required to participate in. Being part of a jury pool would be an example of that. So for them, the system was meant to weaken the influence of the aristocracy and those aristocratic families and create a more balanced representation of citizenship. Cleisthenes established the Boule. It's a council consisting of 500 members. It's responsible for setting the agenda for the ecclesia and overseeing the daily administration of the city-state. Council was composed of 50 members from each of the 10 new tribes that Cleisthenes created. The members of the Boule were selected by lot, a process that ensured broader representation of and reduced control of the elites. So one more of Cleisthenes' innovations is these reforms, and they're this introduction of a process with which Athenian citizens could vote to exile all politician or influential figure who is perceived as a threat to the stability of the state. Anyone want to institute that one? Well, it might seem like a good thing, but it can go awry. So each year the assembly could decide whether to hold this gathering. If held, citizens would write a name of the person they wanted to exile on a pottery shard. So we actually have these from the archaeological record. A sufficient number of votes were cast against a person, they would be exiled for 10 years, although without loss of property or citizenship rights. But you had to get out of town. So he expands political participation and through all those items that we've already mentioned here. So, Athenian role in repelling the Persian invasion. We won't dwell on this since we've already done an entire lecture on the Persian invasion, but we will remind you of just a couple things, that they play a role in defending Greece against the Persian invasion in 490 and 480. After assisting the Ionian Greeks in the rebellion against Persian rule, Athens became a key target of the Persian Empire under Darius I and Xerxes I. So they're known for their naval power. They worked alongside Sparta, and Sparta was mainly the elite infantry forces, and other city-states to mount a unified defense against this vast Persian force. Of course, we can remember the Battle of Marathon, where Athens was involved in 490. It's the first major victory for the Greeks against the Persians. Darius I launches an invasion to punish Athens for supporting the Ionian revolt. Although vastly outnumbered, the Athenians, led by General Miletus, employs this strategy of flanking the Persians by thinning their central part of their formation. And this maneuver led to the stunning Greek victory, with around 10,000 Athenians and their allies defeating something like 25,000 Persian troops. We have larger estimations by some. The battle became a symbol of Athenian courage and really gave them hope that they could defeat this larger army if they were well prepared. So we can also remember Battle of Salamis. So this is 10 years after Marathon. Xerxes I launches this massive invasion to conquer Greece. Following the Persian victories at Thermopylae, the Greek forces regroup, and with Athens leading the Greek naval strategy, the Battle of Salamis was this pivotal naval battle in which the smaller, more maneuverable Greek fleet under the command of the Athenian general Themistocles, they decisively crush the much larger Persian fleet. And Themistocles, he lures the Persian fleet into this narrow strait, and because of the structure and maneuverability of their ships, were able to defeat the Persians, who had a larger fleet, and the ships were larger as well. The victory at Salamis cripples the Persian navy and essentially it's the beginning of the end of the Persian invasion, leading to the Battle of Plataea in 479. So that leads to the formation of this Delian League. So in the aftermath of the Persian Wars, Athens sought to maintain a unified Greek defense against future Persian threat. In 478, Athens spearheaded the formation of the Delian League. It's a coalition of Greek city-states aimed at continuing the fight against the Persians. And another thing they did was protecting Greek interests in the Aegean Sea. That would also include their colonies that were further away. This league initially had the noble goal of mutual defense. Over time, it becomes a vehicle for Athenian imperial ambitions. The league's treasury was housed on the island of Delos. That's a very important location historically. Delos is an important location for trade, for finances, and also for cultural exchange. Delos is one of the places where, in the Hellenistic period, cultural exchange is going to take place. And, for example, foreign religions are going to go to Delos, make its way to the rest of Greece, and then by way of Greece is going to become part of Roman cultural tradition as well. So treasury is housed at Delos, and those later moved to Athens as Athenian influence grew. Athens used the league's funds to build its navy and fortify the city, helping to become the leading power in the Greek world. Eventually, a bunch of the members of the Delian League began to see it as an Athenian move towards imperial domination. And as Athens used its force to keep member states in line, this leads to what eventually becomes the outbreak of the Peloponnesian Wars. So you can see their dominance and their goals begin to rub Sparta, especially Sparta, the wrong way, but others as well. So Athens' leadership and naval strength during the Persian Wars transformed it into a dominant political and military power in Greece. This ushers in the golden age of Athens. Its victories against Persia were also seen as a triumph of Greek independence and freedom against foreign tyranny. This theme continues on through Greek culture and really resonates in Western history. So the rise of democracy, it's following the Persian Wars that Athens transitioned from a leading city-state to an empire through its control over the Delian League, initially formed as a defensive alliance, as we talked about. So Athens increasingly exerted control over its allies, using resources that were supposed to be for everyone. And these imperial ambitions expanded, and that allows them to gain complete hegemony within the region. So we start to move further into democracy as we get deeper into what we call the Golden Age. All right, so here we move into the Golden Age of Athens, and we'll be looking at the age of Pericles, the expansion of democracy, intellectual and cultural life, social and economic structures. So Pericles, he was one of the prominent and influential statesman, orator, general during the Golden Age of Athens. It's his leadership marked the height of Athenian power and culture, and he is often associated with the flourishing of democracy and the arts in Athens. Some of his key contributions we'll be taking a look at here. The first one is expansion of democracy. He strengthened Athenian democracy by expanding the role of the ecclesia, the assembly, which we've mentioned. He has building projects, the Parthenon on the Acropolis, which symbolized Athenian wealth, power, and devotion to the gods. The long walls built to connect Athens to its port. And he expanded their defensiveness and their naval dominance. Pericles, he's a great patron of the arts. He encouraged the development of drama, philosophy, sculptures, his support for playwrights like Aeschylus and Sophocles and others, Aristophanes, for example, as well as other thinkers like Socrates, fosters Athens' intellectual and cultural growth. So the rise of philosophy is, during the Golden Age, Athens becomes the center of philosophical thought. And when we think of that, most of us think of Socrates somewhere around 470 to 400, 399 BC. He emerged as the central figure, promoting a method of questioning to seek truth and challenge. He really challenged the conventional wisdom. He was not afraid to ask any questions or question anyone, no matter their status or how closely held an idea was. So his focus on ethics and virtue influenced generations of thinkers, though he left no writings of his own. So we find a majority, if not all of his stuff, are recorded in Plato, who was sort of the next generation from Socrates. Matter of fact, there's a debate over whether or not Socrates was actually a person or just a figment of Plato's imagination. I think we have solid evidence saying, yes, he was a real person and not just Plato's imaginary friend. Another group that we look at are the sophists. Maybe back up to Socrates for just a minute. He really reminds me of many of the Jewish thinkers from the same time period and moving on, where the Jews, in their approach to biblical studies, really start to ask questions, especially after the Babylonian captivity. And they develop these series of generations of teachers, starting with one of the groups is the earliest groups is Sophrim, followed by the Tanaim. And these people develop this idea of Midrash. And Midrash is looking at a biblical passage or an idea from every single angle possible. And eventually that will give rise to the two Talmuds, the Babylonian Talmud, the Jerusalem Talmud. But it's that kind of thinking that Socrates is famous for, looking at any idea or question or situation from every angle and asking is this the right one? I know you believe this, but is it the best approach? It's what he's eventually killed for. The sophists are a group of itinerant traveling teachers. They rise to prominence during this period, and they taught rhetoric, but they're the skeptics of their day. They're the Stoics. They're the skeptics. They argue that truth could be subjective, and that success in public life depended on persuasive speaking. So are they right? Question becomes that. Well, on this, success in public life depends on your rhetoric, on your persuasive speaking. Yeah, I think that was true then. I think it's true today. Can truth be subjective? I think that the answer to this is, many of you, let me get the entire thing out. The answer to that is yes. Truth is subjective for a godless society. All things are available to you. When we look at things from a biblical worldview, we know that the idea of truth being subjective is not the biblical approach and not part of a worldview. That's why we live in such a confused world. And if we were to go back and look at this time period of Greece, what we'd understand is, even in Athens, there was a lot of cultural confusion. And that's because there's no real standard. And what will eventually happen with Greek culture is they will get rid of their stories that they used for virtue of honor and glory and patriotism and heroism. All those things, the stories, what they're going to do is degrade their own stories. Granted, it's not like they're reading the Bible. Don't get me wrong. But they did have ideas of virtue that could, in some cases, be in agreement with biblical ideas of some of those same ideas. Let's forget natural law. It's in Greek philosophy. It's in the Bible too. So there's places where these things are in agreement, but they lose their own traditions and their own stories. And once those go away, their culture will decline. So we see the same kind of thing happening over and over. So the early natural philosophers, they explored the physical world, and they offer natural explanations for phenomena previously attributed to the gods. So they lay the groundwork for later scientific inquiry. Of course, we can see drama and comedy come out of that. Drama or tragedy flourishes in this period. We have important playwrights, Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides. They produced profound works that explored themes of fate, the gods, human suffering, moral dilemmas. Their tragedies were performed during religious festivals like that of Dionysia, became integral part of Athenian civil and religious life. So this is also, they developed comedies. These are pioneered by important authors. Aristophanes, he offers a different view of Athenian society. His plays are often satirized, so they're satire, and they have different pictures or different kinds of stories of prominent political figures and social issues. Kind of like the Babylonian Bee is today, if you're familiar with that. If you're not, go and check that out. So they blend humor with serious critiques of Athenian democracy and of war and of intellectual trends. And they provide insights into Athenian culture and politics for us. So we can look at how are they using satire to describe political situations. We can look at that and see what the cultural trends were. Much like looking at comedians today, you can see where things are going and where things are being questioned. So historiography, the Golden Age was also witnessed the birth of historiography. Herodotus, he's often called the father of history. He wrote the Histories, or the Inquiry, as an account of the Persian Wars, blending myth and oral tradition and eyewitness accounts. His work marked a new way of recording events by seeking explanations and causes. And he traveled the world. He talked to a lot of different people and puts that into his Histories or Inquiry. Thucydides, you can put him in contrast with that of Herodotus. He takes an analytical approach. His history of the Peloponnesian Wars focuses on human nature, power struggle, and the underlying causes of the war between Athens and Sparta. He's regarded as the first scientific historian for his rigorous methodology and emphasis on fact-based reporting. Herodotus didn't always use fact-based reporting. He tried, though. So Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian War is a very important document for us. It's a detailed and analytical account of the conflict between Athens and Sparta, and it's marking a major shift in historical writings from its focus on human actions and this real politic over divine intervention. So scientific in the change of how he's considering the traditional mythological explanations to understanding how humans are interacting, and he's really looking at causes of things. He is an Athenian general. He was exiled early in the war, so he wrote from a critical, often impartial perspective aimed to provide a clear and accurate account of the events of their causes. Causes of the war. He begins by explaining the underlying causes of the war, emphasizing Spartan fear of Athenian power. He distinguishes between immediate events and deeper, long-term tensions that fueled the conflict. He examines how war reveals the darker side of human nature, such as greed, fear, and ambition. And there's this famous portion called the Melian Dialogue. It really has his views on power politics, where the Athenians argued that might makes right, leaving little room for justice or morality when survival is at stake. So essentially, their philosophy allowed them to indulge in this darker side and throw out morality as long as they were able to survive. I think those things have their roots in the Persian Wars and sort of one of the negative aspects of how Athens developed. So, the course of the war, history follows the war's major phases. The Achaemenian War starts out in 431. It's about 10 years. It's characterized by Sparta's invasion of Attica and Athens' naval superiority. They have this short-term, brief truce in 421 that ultimately fails for the reasons we've already talked about. The reasons for the failure and the reasons for it starting are the same. The Sicilian expedition is where Athens disastrously attempted to conquer Sicily, and that leads to a major defeat. And the final phase is marked by Spartan resurgence and support from Persia, which eventually led to Athens' surrender in 404. So his history is characterized by realism and political analysis. It's considered the first real history focusing on power dynamics, strategy, and the unpredictability of human actions and human nature. He emphasized the role of pragmatism and self-interest in decision-making, often presenting leaders as driven by power rather than ideals. He notes the plagues of Athens. He provides this account of the plague that struck Athens early in the war, and it decimated the population, weakens the city's morale. How would they have interpreted this? Well, the gods must not be looking well upon us at this point. He details almost clinical descriptions of symptoms reflecting his broader attempt to observe events methodically. Let's put it that way. You guys are going to kill me on that one. Leadership and speeches. So throughout the history, Thucydides includes speeches that reveal key political arguments and insights into leadership. There's this part, the funeral oration of Pericles, and it's one of the most famous parts. And Pericles celebrates Athenian democracy and its cultural achievements while urging the citizens to endure hardship of war. Then there's some incomplete works that we have of his as well. Overall, his histories is marked by its rigorous attention to fact, exploration of the human condition in times of crisis, focused on power and political strategy. His work is still regarded as foundational in the field of history, international relations, and political science. All right, social and economic structure. The social and economic structure of ancient Athens was characterized by this distinct hierarchy that included citizen. They had medics or foreigners. They have slaves. They each play a critical role in city-states, how it functions. Citizens had full political rights and participated directly in the democratic process, while others, who were often skilled artisans or traders, contributed to the economy but lacked citizen rights. Slaves, who were a significant portion of the population, performed various tasks, from the household duties to labors in the workshops and on farms. Trades vital for Athenian prosperity, and that's one of those things that it's bolstered by its navy. That's why one of the reasons the navy was so important. It safeguarded maritime routes and facilitated commerce with other regions. In other words, you're not going to invest in trade someplace that's unsafe, or that Persians or Phoenicians or someone might pick off your ships or your goods or your funds while they're in someone else's port or while they're at sea. So religion in the Golden Age. During the Golden Age of Athens, religion obviously plays a central role in the daily lives of citizens. It's deeply intertwined into both public and private life. The Athenians worshipped a pantheon of gods and goddesses, with Athena, the city's patron deity, holding this great significance there, especially in the form of the pantheon on the Acropolis. So they have religious festivals, and such as the Panthenia and the Dionysia. And these are their crucial events that foster civic pride, featuring athletic competitions, dramatic performances, and processions honoring the gods, or parades. These festivals not only served as expressions of devotion, but also reinforced community identity and social cohesion. So they also have the mysteries, these mystery religions, especially with this Eleusinian mystery. And in these cases, they offer personal spiritual experiences that people sought. And they would seek these experiences for profound questions about the existence of the afterlife. So, kind of like the New Age today. So, literature. So, we've talked about the Iliad, Homer's Iliad. It's this epic poem during the final weeks of the Trojan War, focusing on the Greek hero Achilles and his wrath. The story begins with the dispute between Achilles and Agamemnon, the great leader, over the spoils of war, leading Achilles to withdraw from battle. As the Greeks struggle without their greatest warrior, the Trojan hero Hector gains the upper hand. The death of Achilles' close friend drives Achilles back into the fight, culminating in his revenge against Hector. The poem explores themes of honor, glory, brutality of war, and the will of the individual, and providing a deep examination of human emotion, grief and pride. So, what really happens here is it's really the idea of glory and honor. And Achilles is given honor by the gift of a woman. And I forget some of the details. I can't remember if she was a slave or anyways, but she was a gift. So you can see Greek culture. And she's taken away from him and given to someone else. That makes him concerned about the honor that he's given, and therefore, where is his glory? We're going to talk about those phrases in Greek culture here for a minute. Just want to bring out the characters. The Achaeans, that's Achilles, that's Agamemnon. Achilles is the greatest warrior. Agamemnon is the leader of the Greek forces. Those are the main. Odysseus, he's king of Ithaca, but he's gonna really play the major role in the Odyssey, and it's Odysseus's journey back home. And then we have the rest there. Each are important, but we'll mention them all today. Trojan characters. Hector, he's the greatest Trojan warrior and prince of Troy. He's ultimately killed by Achilles. Priam is the elderly king of Troy, father of Hector and Paris, who bravely seeks out Achilles to recover Hector's body once Hector's been killed. Paris, he's prince of Troy, and he's that guy that starts the whole mess by abducting Helen. And that's what initiates the war. Helen is the wife of Menelaus, whose abduction by Paris leads to the Trojan War. That's, go back here, Menelaus. He's king of Sparta and brother of Agamemnon. His wife Helen is taken by Paris, and that sparks the Trojan War. And we'll skip the rest of those. Gods and goddesses that are in this. Zeus, king of the gods, who oversees the conflict, but he tries to remain neutral. Hera is queen of the gods and supporter of the Greeks, often manipulating Zeus to favor her side. Athena, goddess of wisdom and warfare, strong supporter of the Greeks. By the way, they're kind of all Greeks. This is all Greek on Greek violence. So we see Apollo. He's god of the sun and archery. He supports the Trojans and often intervenes in their favor. Aphrodite, she's goddess of love and beauty who supports the Trojans, especially Paris, after awarding him Helen. Thetis is the sea goddess, and the mother of Achilles, who pleads Zeus on behalf of her son. Pleads with Zeus. So, the Iliad. The two phrases that we've already mentioned, glory and honor. In the Iliad, glory or kleos is a term refers to glory or fame, particularly the kind of renown that one earns through heroic deeds in battle. It's often linked to how a warrior's name will be remembered long after his death. So that's the idea of glory in their view. Time is honor, and it refers to tangible rewards, spoils of war. It relates to the intangible respect or status, but they really understood this idea of honor, or time, as the stuff you had. In modern terms, we might put this as in honor through materialism, and through materialism we gain glory. So the Bible writers for glory, they don't like kleos. They prefer the term doxa. That's where we get the term doxology. You may have sung the doxology. In the Bible, doxa is common translation of the Hebrew word kavod, and it means glory, honor, majesty, respect, or weight. Doxa can also mean radiance or splendor. It can refer to the light of stars or planets or radiance of God's character. So, we'll talk about Greek with it. Kleos is really the idea of heroes achieving immortality through their acts their fame and their lineage. So doxa, the quality of splendid, remarkable appearance. We're just kind of making a contrast with the doxa, and especially the glory of God at times with what they viewed as glory. So even Solomon in all his splendor was not arrayed like one of these, or in all its splendor as a flower. So just this idea of glory really goes far beyond what the Greeks in the Iliad were considering here. Doxa, you can see in the ways, the senses of the word, it's primarily one that's glory or state. So the Greeks don't have this idea of being in the state of glory or glorification. So time is primarily looked at being in the state of honor. And the Greeks definitely do not understand that in the Iliad. They're more down here. Time is value. So when they look at honor, we look at being in a state, God being a state of honor. They're looking at it through a materialistic framework. So biblical writers use honor differently. So time, honor as an element in the assignment of status to a person. Honor, respect, status. This will bring you honor in the presence of all the other guests. Luke 14:10. So in the Iliad, honor is goods-based and not a state of being. So just like to bring that out. I think it's an important part to understand that portion of ancient literature. The Odyssey is Homer's sequel to Iliad, following the Greek hero Odysseus' 10-year journey home after the fall of Troy. The epic details in his adventure as he faces numerous challenges, including encounters with the Cyclops. He runs into this witch, basically, enchantress, and he comes across the sirens as well as he descended into the underworld. He also confronts the wrath of the sea god Poseidon, who seeks to prevent his return. Meanwhile, in Ithaca, his wife Penelope fends off suitors vying for her hand, believing Odysseus to be dead. The poem highlights themes of cunning, loyalty. That's Odysseus. If you read the Iliad, cunning is who Odysseus is, in contrast to Achilles, who's a mighty warrior. Now, my recommendation is go find the Wishbone version of this on YouTube and watch it if you want to do something. It's family friendly. The Odysseus story of the Odyssey, in its full version, it's kind of PG-17 rated, I would say. The Peloponnesian War. We'll look at its causes. We've kind of looked at the causes. We'll just breeze past those. Key events of the war we'll touch on a little bit, and we won't worry too much about the decline as we've talked about it. It's this protracted and devastating conflict between Athens and Sparta, rooted in the rising tensions that went along with Athenian imperialism. So early battles are marked by setbacks such as the plagues of Athens, which decimated the Athenian population. But ultimately, Athens faced a steep decline once they are defeated. Cause of the war, like we've mentioned, is really these rising tensions between Athens and Sparta. How funds were handled within the Delian League, and that league really develops into an Athenian empire that Sparta particularly was uncomfortable with. Others as well. So we'll just run through a few of these key battles. Battle of Sambata. This is a naval battle. It was a precursor to the war fought between Corcyra, and they're an Athenian ally, and Corinth. There's a Spartan ally. So you can see how these things begin. The Battle of Potidæa, it's an early conflict where Athens laid siege to Potidæa, a Corinthian colony, and there's this prolonged siege that strained Athenian resources and marked the formal start of the war. Napacatus, it's a significant naval engagement where the Athenian fleet under Phormio defeated the Peloponnesian fleet. This victory allowed Athens to maintain dominance at sea. That becomes a major part of their identity. The Battle of Pylos, the Athenians, led by Themistocles, established a fort at Pylos, trapping the Spartan force on the island of Phacteria, and this resulted in a rare Spartan surrender. So this boosts Athenian morale. Battle of Delium. So it's a land battle, so we're at 424 at this point, where the Athenians led by him, and they're defeated by the Boeotians, allied with Sparta. So significant loss for Athenians in central Greece. So the Battle of Amphipolis, it's a crucial battle where both Athenian general Cleon and the Spartan general Brasidas were killed. This battle's outcome paved the way for a temporary peace. So if everyone's generals get killed, that's meant things were pretty bad. Then we follow up with a Sicilian expedition, and although not a single battle, the Athenian campaign into Sicily aimed at capturing Syracuse. It's this disastrous failure, and Athens lost a significant portion of its fleet and army. So this was not what they wanted, obviously. So the Battle of Cranassima, it's a naval victory for Athens during a difficult period in the war, where the Athenians managed to defeat the Peloponnesian fleet and maintain control over the Hellespont. The Battle of Argonys it's another naval victory for Athens, where they defeated the Spartan fleet. However, a failure to rescue survivors after the battle led to controversy and the execution of Athenian generals. And last, the Battle of Agaspotami. The decisive battle where the Spartan fleet under Lysander destroyed the Athenian navy. The loss effectively ended the war as Athens was cut off from its grain supplies and forced to surrender in 404. Which it's ultimately the defeat of their navy that brings about the end of the war. And I've always considered, we go back to the expedition Sicily. You know, it's ended in 413. It's like 7 years. We have these final battles, 7-8 years. We get into this area. How things would have went if they had skipped over that and maintained their navy. So, briefly, latter Athens from decline to Macedonian rule. We're going to brush over this because we'll rehash some of this once we get into the next stages. Athens, after the Peloponnesian War, recovery under democratic reforms. They have cultural achievements despite political weakening, and Athens under Macedonian influence. They have this response and role of Demosthenes and the Macedonian factions. So we'll just kind of touch on those real quick. After the Peloponnesian War, Athens faced a period of political and economic decline. Sorry. Actually, I think we'll save the rest of those for our future lectures, since we've gone a little bit long here. We'll just touch on this instead. So we'll just summarize off of this slide. The legacy of ancient Athens is democracy and the influence on later civilizations. We can see all through this lecture elements that we still have in society today. There's this enduring influence on the Roman Republic and Roman Republicanism. They contribute today to Western culture and civilization. They have had this lasting impact through philosophy, literature, and art, and preservation of Athenian heritage through Roman adoption and Athens in historical memory. We still have these myths and reality and perception of Athens' golden age, and the role of Athens, of course, continues to influence us in educational curriculums and how we broadly look at the world. So with that, if I can be of any assistance to you, please get a hold of me. I hope you just have a blessed week.